Good evening. You're very welcome to MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland. We're streaming live this evening from the Rococo Room here in our home in UCD Newman House on St. Stephen's Green. My name is Benedict Shepherd-Connolly. I'm the digital curator here at MoLI, and do come and visit us here soon in the museum. Our exhibitions, cafe, shop and gardens are open 6 days a week. This event is especially resonant for us here at MoLI because it marks the return to holding events such as this here in the building. And we're delighted to have a very small audience of friends here with us this evening. This is our first real-life audience in many, many months, so it's a very special occasion for us. For this event, titled Late Launch, we're joined by 5 of our finest poets, all of whom released new collections during the pandemic. With us here are Emily Cooper, Nidhi Zak, Aria Eipe, Miho Mccann, Charles Lange, and Stephen Sexton, and Stephen will be leading the discussion this evening. It's an honour for us to have these cherished poets with us this evening and to celebrate these wonderful new collections. And if you haven't got copies of all 5 of them yet, I would encourage you to purchase one very soon. We'll be posting, for anybody that's joining us online, we'll be posting links in the chat over the course of the next hour. If you do enjoy this evening's programme, we'd encourage you to buy MoLI membership or to make a donation to support the museum. Your support will help fund so many aspects of our programming and activity here at the museum, including regular new exhibitions, inspiring free workshops for school children, free admission for job seekers, carers and frontline workers, subsidised ticket prices for thousands of visitors, dozens of free online events, hundreds of podcasts, exciting contemporary commissions, 2 beautiful gardens and 1 digital radio station. So please do visit moli.ie/support to find out more about that. If you do wish to become a member of MoLI, please visit moli.ie/membership. And if you use the discount code Late Launch, that's all one word, Late Launch, you will receive a 25% discount, but only this evening, so do act fast on that. And with that, I'll hand you over to our chair this evening, Stephen Sexton. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Thank you very much for joining us this evening at the Museum of Literature Ireland, and thank you especially to the museum for hosting us so warmly, so generously, so safely. Thanks everyone for joining us. So, Gerald Stern said, "Poets are people who go crazy when other people win prizes." Elaine Nicolanine said, "Poets are almost human." Whatever a poet is, I want to suggest that what we call a poet might be a person who can't be dissuaded from thinking that now is the moment for poetry. Now, always, always now. Now, they say, finally, this relatively quiet art will demonstrate its capacity to observe and record and reconfigure events and people and circumstances. A poem might last, if not for all time, at least for a little longer than it took to write. If only poets would quit going on about how now is the moment for poetry, we might believe them. As with everything, though, people who say that are only half wrong. Now is surely a moment for poetry. It is by no means the only art that thrives on the interconnectedness of things and people and ideas, but it is distinctly involved with metaphor and simile. Poetry is thrilled that one thing is like another thing, one circumstance like another. And the isolation we've experienced asked us to reconsider that fundamental gesture of poetry, that things are kept apart, things shouldn't be kept apart. But these poems always persevere. From a lack of connections, poems make connections. And though the engineers of our societies are at work repairing the severed cables and telephone exchange faults and intermittent connections of interpersonal intimacy, how's that for a metaphor? Their work is not yet complete, but soon, and by then that soon will be now. It's always now. The books we celebrate tonight have been published during the lockdown. They did not quite get to enjoy the full, generous moment of their now. But fortunately, that now extends all the way to this evening. We're delighted you can join in the celebration of these books and in the conversation of their authors. The evening's format will be as follows. Our poets will each read for 7 or so minutes, and after each of those readings, I'll put a question to them about their approach to their work and a second question to the group as a whole. Some of them might answer, some of them might not answer. We'll find out. And at the end of our evening, we'll welcome some questions from you in the room and from you, our audience, not in the room. We thank you for your attendance tonight. We hope you enjoy this expression of now. So I'm going to introduce all of the poets at once, I thought, and they will read in this order. Miho Mccann is from Derry. His poems have recently appeared in Poetry Ireland Review, Ambit, The Rialto, and Banshee. A pamphlet of poems, Safe Home, was published by Green Bottle Press in 2020, and he was selected by Kai Miller for the National Centre for Writing's International Literature Showcase 2021. He is currently working on a collaborative text with Kerry Doherty for Skein Press's Solstice series, forthcoming in 2022. Emily Cooper is a poet and writer whose work has been published in The Stinging Fly, Banshee, Hotel, Poetry Ireland Review, and Bath Mag, among others. She has been granted residencies and funding by the Arts Councils of Ireland and Northern Ireland, the Irish Writers' Centre, Centre Culturel Irlandais Paris, Greywood Arts, and Donegal County Council. In 2019, Emily was a recipient of the Next Generation Award and took part in Poetry Ireland introductions. Her debut pamphlet, Glass, was published by Makina Books last month, August. Emily is currently writing a book on solitude as well as a collaborative poetry collection on Picasso's lovers with the poet Joe Burns. She lives in Ramelton, Donegal. Charles Lange is from Castlemilk in Glasgow. His work has appeared in Gutter, Poetry Ireland Review, The Rialto, Under the Radar, and elsewhere. In 2020, he published his first book of poems, I OK, with Speculative Books. In 2019, he was awarded the University of Edinburgh's Sloane Prize for Writing in Dialect. He is currently a creative writing PhD candidate at the Seamus Heaney Centre, Queen's University, Belfast. As If, a specially commissioned portfolio of poetry exploring the city as a site of possibility and temporality, was published with Fallow Media this week, perhaps even today. Nidhi Zak, Aria Eipe, is a poet, pacifist, and fabulist. Born in India, she grew up across the Middle East, Europe, and North America before calling Ireland home. Founder of the Play It Forward Fellowships for Underrepresented Writers, she is poetry editor at Skein Press and Fallow Media and contributing editor with The Stinging Fly. She is the recipient of a Next Generation Artist Award in Literature from the Arts Council of Ireland and serves on the advisory board of Culture Ireland and Diversifying Irish Poetry. Auguries of a Minor God, her first collection, was published with Faber and Faber in July 2021. So first, we welcome Miho Mccann.
Hi again. It's lovely to be here. I published this in June 2020, and it was finalised before the pandemic hit. And there's an epigraph which took on another kind of resonance afterwards, so I'll read that. It's by Sinead Morrissey. It's from her book, Through the Square Window. Sanctuary was still sanctuary, except more so, with the inside holding flickeringly and the outside clamouring in. So I'll read the first poem in the pamphlet now. I read this once at on a Zoom reading, as we've all been doing over the last year, and it's about going to the Ulster Hall in Belfast to watch violin soloists write. And anyway, you'll get why people thought I was really nasty, but a lot of people said after, they were like, the first half of that poem, I thought you were just a really malicious, horrible person, but it makes we'll get there. We'll get there. This is called Etude. I'll go to concerts in the Ulster Hall a few times a year to see the violin soloists. My friends think that this is because I want to learn fingerboard electric dashes of the Shostakovich or the Barber. Nothing so heroic. I go in the hope that something goes wrong. The gold-plated E-string snapping mid-cadenza, an earring slipping off, bouncing on the chin rest, then the floor, pop, pop, bang. How these people can deal with disaster at a moment's notice. The string snapping in the middle of a mournful B section of something chike-like. Could I learn this coping? So I already made the joke about sitting beside Stephen Sexton reading a poem about video games, but I'm going to read a poem about a video game now that's directed to a younger brother. And if you're familiar with the game Minecraft, this will maybe make more visual sense. This is called Apology. Sleep is not answering the phone, while the directors of our terrain, we imagine them as coyotes in carrot-coloured pantsuits, ignore the line that runs red hot along the gated field by our house. You, fireboy, lavish inside, the day's sun knocks against your drawn curtain. And from the outside, your room flashes with strobe bang brilliance. An Irish heat distorts the pavement, but fear not, you are building a city. This room you game in, your bolt hole was mine long ago, but I lost the deed. Keep it, and keep your hands molded around what allows control of your world. When I roar about reading or wild herbs, I only envy this wonderful new world you craft. Its crystal blue water, how the villagers shout hail to everyone. This world built block by grassy block, gold brown truffles, fish leap the river. Your brow is smooth, no telltale furrow. I pull the curtain tighter, settle to watch. See, as I said, I published this in June of last year, and I think I'm really interested when a poem's like completed on the page. It's not finished, it's not done right. Like, so a poem about a dog, and the dog passes away, it becomes an elegy for the dog, and so on and so on. So I wrote this poem about a friend who left, and that situation has been remedied. So, so it's not quite as desolate as it sounds, maybe. But I think this maybe. I was thinking, I suppose, when I wrote it about there was like reckonings of lockdown, and people were starting to make arrangements to get ready for it, and I wondered about how when a friend leaves and you realize in their absence you actually have taken on speech patterns or ways of speaking, and actually I found that a really effective way of keeping people with you in many ways. Anyway, this poem is called Fried Egg Sandwich. Ellen, the night has been at the unlocked door since you left and isn't going away despite my loud reading about somewhere, anywhere else. Your face has become acquainted with my worn, pocked phone screen, sanctuary spilling out. Let us be courageous, you'd say. Birdsong pecks through my rudimentary speaker, and whiskers of garnet flowers bob behind you. I'm there and never have been there. I've begun to say man when I mention a person or conclude a tough day, breathing out quietly. I've internalized how you speak, we live our love, and take you with me as I unlock the front door to find a carton of fresh eggs. Oh man, I'll say as one breaks it, laughing over my jorts. Oh man, I'll say as an afternoon rain comes on over my yard, and if it blesses yours too, that you have that huge parka that Joni is playing from the radio inside so faintly she could be confused for hope. And I'm going to leave it there.
Thanks very much, Miho. Thanks for summoning technical glitches by reading a poem about a musician suffering a disaster at a moment's notice. Thanks for
Missed opportunity.
Yeah, I guess my silly little metaphor about network connectivity is, sorry, I'm a part of it too. So, Miho, as well as being a poet, you're a musician, as that poem suggested. Have those, that's many years of practice and attention. To a different kind of art, a sympathetic art, but a different one. Has that affected how you write poems, would you say? Are those entirely different parts of your, artistic life or imagination? What's that been like? Do you see them as the same? Are they different? I suppose that's what I'm asking.
I think there's resonances in one and the other. Particularly, I grew up in a very musical family, so I played the violin. There was no question. But from a very young age, you come to become aware that the music world is always about people who are better than you, in inverted commas. So it breaks down aspiration quite quickly. But it is also aspirational in the sense you're always trying to get better. You listen to these massive figures, there was a list the length of your arm of these kind of like superstar violinists that played through my house. And my mom trained me to hear the differences between each recording of Bach that Hilary Hahn did, and it's like Perlman did, and Midori did, and so on. And what I transferred from that when I started to write poems, well, I guess, was that you have these massive figures of poetry, and then very few people reach that, and it's all about, most musicians are orchestral players. So I very quickly was drawn to the community of poetry rather than the kind of glamour of it. I would say if I was, I'm not a soloist poet, I'm an orchestral musician poet or whatever. So I think it's probably not in the way you'd think. I could say something like, I'm interested in the singing line or something, but we all are. It's a bit of a silly thing. So.
And is that out of interest? Is that related to voice? I mean, one of the things that writers are always, well, not always, but often told that one of the things they need or what distinguishes them is like discovering or acquiring or stealing a voice. I mean, is that the same kind of thing for a really world-class violinist? Is it about the identity of the style or performance? Is that comparable?
I wonder. I mean, all of the superstar violinists have their own style. I guess bring violins into everything, but yes, yeah. I just rather not bore everyone, but so perhaps in the way that like Hilary Hahn has quite a cold, like virtuosic technique, maybe one could detect aspects of a Heaney poem or perhaps an Ivan Bolan poem that would be distinctively theirs, maybe. But then I think the really stunning thing about poetry to me is how that like aspects of Ivan Bolan and Sinead Morrissey and all these people trickle down. I think that's what's more interesting. The community aspect of writing and poetry is more tangible, even though in music it's there as well. Because
Thanks, Miho. I mean, I thought I would ask a sort of slightly more general question. This is what we might do. I might pose a sort of targeted question, if that's not too abrupt, to each of our readers, and then something slightly more general. And I sort of thought I would ask everyone, have there been experiences or practices or jobs or hobbies or habits that have kind of retrospectively, that have become retrospectively useful in your creative life? Did you do anything at another point where where the same impulse that you enjoy when you're writing a poem, you think, oh well, that's what that was. I feel as though music is maybe a comparable, but I don't know. Have any of you done any interesting experiences that feel relevant to your creative life?
Well, I used to be a chef and a few other things, a gardener for a while, and I think that act of creation in food or tending in gardening are definitely related to the act of writing poetry or even reading poetry.
So definitely, yeah. I can definitely see that. I know the same thing with cooking. I mean, sometimes it's nice to be doing the thing more than it is. For me, anyway, it's nice to be doing the thing more than what the outcome is. But,
yeah, it's a funny thing, isn't it?
You make a lot of mistakes, personally speaking. But, well, I mean, you have some poems that I think are relevant to some of those subjects. So I wonder if you might read us a few poems, Emily.
Yeah, I've got a poem, a garlicking poem. This actually came about because I read wild garlic used as a verb, and I thought it was really funny. So I wrote this poem, Garlicking. Until I was an adult, I always burnt the garlic. It charcoals so quickly in hot oil. To temper the heat, you must first add onions, perhaps some carrots and celery. If you choose to add the garlic first, never look away. Soon you add the tomatoes. A quick cooling is civilizing, such as a swim in a cold sea after you've had a row. The sea and tears have the same composition. They taste the same. Consider while garlicking your sourdough, it will not rise. The antiseptic qualities of the garlic interfere with the propagation of the yeast. Their similar wildnesses do nothing to cohere the two. You must add larger volumes of yeast. Allow it to bubble to excess. Give longer rising times. Be gentle, but not overly considerate. Use the better basket. Raw garlic thins the blood. My grandfather swore by it. He also recommended large plastic bottles of 7-Up and many hours spent watching snooker in bed. A garlic clove in the vagina is a treatment for thrush. Be forewarned of the lingering metallic taste of garlic in your mouth. Do not be alarmed. It seems obvious. All those things are connected. Will I just carry on to my next?
Yeah, please do.
It's really wonderful to be reading in this room, especially as the first reading of this selection of poems, as there's a real preoccupation with Georgian architecture, because I moved into a house in Donegal a few years ago that is Georgian and quite has its own personality. So this Georgian room is kind of a grand connection. So this is Incredible Things Do Happen. A tiny person at Edith Piaf's grave turned to my parents and told them, I am her sister. Her bones were birdy, twisted and brittle, like those left on the number 171, stripped of flesh in a small cardboard box. Her body doubled in on itself, forehead reaching closer to the concrete of the tomb, her stick the only thing contriving to separate the two. Perhaps it was a lie. Whoever this woman was, she's in the repertoire now, joining the Kennedys playing baseball in their garden in Cape Cod, an immigration inspector who flipped my mother's passport photo off with her long acrylic nails, and the young man who presented my aunt with a huge bunch of flowers in Neary's, apropos of nothing.
Thank you very much, Emily. That concludes our northwest section of the evening. Thank you both, Miho and Emily. So I wanted to ask you, Emily, a question, I suppose, broadly about place. And you've mentioned this, that you live in rather rural Donegal. And I suppose I wanted to ask, do you feel that distance from urban centres, which is, certainly a challenging place to be recently, I think, as opposed to the countryside. But does that distance from urban centres, with populations and distractions, does that have an impact on your work, would you say? Do your poems correspond in some way or another to the places they were written? And I know you've written in a lot of places and lived in a lot of places. So I suppose that's what I'm asking. How about where you live now? Is it affecting the kind of work that you produce?
I think that the house especially has been a really big inspiration to me. It's one of those interesting places where there are a lot of little artifacts and histories that are there to be discovered. To be honest, it doesn't even feel that rural. I think in the last couple of years living there, because things have been so contained, it was kind of the ideal place to be. And now that things are opening up again, it feels almost metropolitan. It's actually quite a shock sometimes to come to a city at this stage. But I do find that I really like change, and I find that really stimulating in my writing. I like to, create new lives for myself, and then create work from that. I think I've been questioning for years about whether poetry is fiction or non-fiction, and I've dug myself quite a deep hole in the matter. And I've kind of resolved to constructing poetry out of life as opposed to making it up. I don't think I can make stuff up, so I kind of require quite a lot of environmental stimulation for content, really. So yeah, I definitely think place has a huge impact on what I write.
And maybe a more general question, I suppose, for you, and for everyone else too. I'm certainly personally very interested, in how place affects, how certain things are written. Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, do you, Emily, do the rest of you, believe in any kind of, psychic or emotional landscape, of childhood or adolescence? I mean, sometimes it's hard to escape the places where you have significant life events or the rock groups that you discover at certain points that are terrible now but can't leave them behind. I mean, there are certain things that happen at certain ages that you can't leave them. And I wonder, I mean, our places, the places work for your imagination like that? Like, I mean, I know Heaney, for example, and a lot of poets were always working kind of imaginatively out of a certain kind of landscape. And, is that true for any of the rest of it? I mean, Nidhi, you're someone who's sort of lived in many different places. Is there any one sort of landscape that is there for you, or does that is that just not important?
I think that the landscape in my head is actually, like, my head is a very strange place. There are random sort of lyrics and fragments and images that come into it. And I think what I do in the poem is I try and pull those into the light a little bit. And I think because I did move around a lot growing up, I wasn't really rooted anywhere. And so the place that I did find myself rooted was in my own imagination. And it can be a very, I think it can be a very rich place, but also just a very bizarre space, and some of the poems in your new collection kind of speak to that as well, this idea of the spectral or the supernatural, things that when you juxtapose them against each other, they're just quite weird, So I don't think like geographical place has influenced me as much as just a more kind of imaginative space.
Yeah, I understand, Nidhi, thank you. I mean, Charlie, I might ask you a similar question. I mean, you specify a very specific place in your sort of biography. You say Castlemilk in Glasgow, and I suppose on one hand that's honest, but I also it's accurate. Does it have a certain kind of place? Are you emotionally there sometimes?
I guess there's a certain element of pride in that, I think, writing about a certain place that's maybe been seen in certain ways by everybody, I think. So there's certain I don't know, certain reputation that a place has that maybe is unfair, and then the instinctual reaction is to sort of defend it or something like that. So I think that's what that comes from. But the place itself isn't really in my mind, but things happening in the place, if that makes sense. So it's easier, as Emily says, to sort of go new places and write about the image of the place itself. But for somewhere like Castlemilk, where I grew up, it's the things that are happening there rather than the image of the streets or the image of certain places, if you know what I mean.
I do, and I suppose you're joining well, as many people do, a very particular tradition of Irish writers who discover the best way to write about Ireland is to leave it, which is always an interesting kind of thing. But I mean, I suppose, Charlie, it would be wonderful to hear a couple of those poems. I mean, would you say that the poems you'll read first are they there in some shape or form, or are they around about? Or?
I think so. I think they're certainly there, and particularly the last one, which I'll read. But I guess that came from I spent the lockdown in Ireland and Dublin, and I guess there's certainly an element I wanted to be back there, I suppose. So, but first I'll continue the theme of food, which I think has been well established. I'll read two poems for this book, and then I'll read another one from the digital project, which Stephen mentioned, which came out today. It's called As If, but cool. I will read this first. This poem is called Saturday Morning. There's something admirable about turning up in the pissing rain every Saturday to get beat 9, 10, sometimes 11 nothing. Knees covered in various shades of mud. The fat keeper's sick and tired of picking the ball out the net. It's probably all his fault. It's probably all his fault. He has one job, and the one job is to keep the ball out the net. But the defence aren't doing their job well enough. The midfield never track back, and the striker poaches, waiting for his chance to make it 9, 10, maybe 11-1. Glory hunting bastard. He just stands there idle, an imitation of his favourite player with his spiky hair in the latest Total 90s. His one-on-one chance to put the ball in the back of the net is a dirty toe poke straight at the keeper, an absolute sitter. "You couldn't finish your dinner," screams the hungover manager. Which reminds me, there's a burger van selling burgers, hot dogs, rolls and sausage, chips, chips and gravy, chips and curry, chips and cheese, Lucozade, Mars bars, cans of ginger, tea in polystyrene cups. So this is the last poem to, I guess, come into this wee book of poems that was also the last one that was written, which was during the whatever we've been going through the past year and a half. It's called Tomorrow. Tomorrow. And in the morning, the alarm clock breaks the dawn, the sun and the birds, of course the trees, the birds and the trees, and the bin men bouncing bins about the street. The neighbours yorkie, yapping like fuck out the back, the kettle on, toasting beans. The postman rattling the letterbox, council tax bills, farm food leaflets, 24 degrees. The windows open, the washing out, nice breeze. And the birds, of course, the birds and the trees and the whole lot of it, the full shebang. Before I read the final poem, I just want to say what a privilege it is to read these amazing people. It's been a long time and it's really nice. So the digital project came out, all the poems were written during the pandemic, I guess, and it came out today. It's called As If. I'll read the first poem from it. It's called The Amusements. The whole place is a circus of flashing lights and screens, buttons, bleeps and pucks pinging around air hockey tables, the occasional yas as somebody reaps the reward. For the night, you can become an F1 racer, a basketball player, or a pop star's backing dancer. Whatever tickles your fancy, maybe all free. It's so easy to lose yourself in the thrill of it. Give it a go, please try again. Most people do. Insert coin after coin after coin until there's none left. Look, there's a wee boy greeting because his da failed to grab a Pokemon toy after umpteen attempts. The guilt trip is a long walk back to the caravan. They'll come again tomorrow, the next day, the day after that, fuck the full week if that's how long it takes. He's been saving up all year for this. Imagine I had the bottle to run up and volley that fucking 2p machine, making money flood out like a waterfall. Come to think it, actually, who's going to stop me?
Wonderful, Charlie. Thanks very much. Yeah, we could say any number of things I think about those poems. I mean, yeah, the incredible subtexts that are often under them, which, sort of demand to be looked at twice, which is, I mean, perhaps how you're writing about the place that you grew up, you know, at the very least demanding that somebody looks at it at least twice. But I think it's fair to say that more often than not, the poems are very, very, very funny, which I think is really remarkable. And I mean, one of the things that Heaney says at some point, to mention Heaney again, in his book of interviews, Stepping Stones with Dennis O'Driscoll, he says of his book Fieldwork, something that I always thought really important, that he made a particular effort in those poems to include elements of his social self, which I take to mean that the poems became a bit more like him as a social person. And I suppose I wanted to ask, I mean, do you feel your poems are in any way like you? I don't know what that means. It's a very open question, but do you feel they are like you, even in the sense of humour or outlook or?
Probably not very funny, but I guess that there is a certain element in using humour to maybe distract from what's maybe not necessarily difficult but uncomfortable to talk about. But also that like sometimes awkward interactions are particularly funny, and it's nice to draw attention to them and sort of think about them. The poems, I guess, I think similar to what Emily said, is that they are mostly about my life, with a certain element of imagination. So well, for example, the Yorkie in the poem is my Yorkie, but it felt easier to blame it on the neighbour. So it's certainly like I don't really have an extensive imagination where I can, or even the urge. I guess like every poem that I write comes from an urge or a memory or something that I feel has to be on the page, and I guess that imagination doesn't really happen like that. So it's easier for me to use my experience, I suppose, as the starting point for the poem, and then see where it takes me, which is often not the realistic representation of the image in my mind, but sure, that's where the poem goes, and that's what happens.
And we've had, Cheryl and I have had many conversations about the poems. I'm fascinated by them all the time. And I mean, I suppose one of the things that is certainly very interesting, you might agree, is voice, and the voice's relationship with with tone and register and English, and the sort of angle at which we all approach English as a language. And there are any number of ways we could describe it. But I mean, what's your relationship, Charlie, with English? I mean, how do you describe the we've talked about English. It's not Scots. Is it dialect? It's not quite dialect. It's just a person saying poems.
I think that's it, and I think I don't really, I think I've been asked many times about like the political implications and also I guess like the national implications, or even what it means not to use what is known to be standard English. But like I don't think it comes from any of that. It just like it's easier for me to write how I do because that's the way I think. That's how I sort of interpret the world, and that's how my brain operates. So it's easier for me to put that on the page than it is to almost translate it into a way that doesn't feel real to me, if that makes sense. And also I guess it's closest to my experience, so I guess that's where it comes from, rather than any sort of need to determine any political or nationalistic position, I think. And also that like I don't really believe in Scots, but sure, that's another.
We'll talk about that elsewhere. But I mean, it's fast. I mean, I suppose as as long as that gesture is all true, you can move the Yorkie next door if you got it. The structure is true. We'll talk maybe a little more about whether or not people resemble their poems in a moment. But I might just take an opportunity to remind you, our lovely guests, that if you have some questions that are more provocative and that our speakers can't really wriggle out of, there will be an opportunity to ask those. And the same is true for our wonderful viewers who are tuning in from all sorts of places. We would really welcome your questions. But perhaps we'll move on to our final reader of the evening, who is Nidhi. Please read us some of your wonderful work.
Thank you. So I'm going to read a poem about an animal called a maned wolf. A maned wolf is a type of canid that resembles a fox on stilts. It's got really long legs. And these animals are incredibly secretive. They're really shy. And they don't give away their emotions or what they're feeling through their behavior. So recently some researchers did an experiment, and they found that if they put it's like a little probe next to the animal's heart, it kind of records what's happening, so you can tell whether the animal is nervous or excited or stressed or happy by looking at those recordings. So this poem, Self-Portrait with Shyness, sort of draws on that research. Maybe I am a maned wolf, lanky, tremulous legs, as if I stepped in something knee-deep and dark it makes me. Look as though I can dance or keep it all close to my torso. This is why I skitter when alarmed. Maybe I am a maned wolf on the inside, so say you were to slit a slight incision by my breast, place an alien object in my chest, it would show up as light and pulse. For you, my heart, would it still thrill now when it senses you near? for the rhythm that it makes is yours, how it swells in my belly, how I sing. I'm going to read you a poem which is a stolen poem. So T.S. Eliot once wrote, "Immature poets imitate mature poets' style." And I think one of the manifestations of this in poetry is the center, which is a form of poem that is a collage of different lines borrowed from various poems. So this poem is a tribute to the poems that have arrested me over the years, including ones by Ivan Boland, Wendell Berry, Mary Oliver, Leila Shatti, Seamus Heaney, Sappho. You might recognize some of these lines. And the title is from a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke. So this is called "What Birds Plunge Through Is Not the Intimate Space." She can't believe this jag-winged majesty really wants a piece of her. Creature stealing up, rising like a black and leafy ledge into the honey-bearing chaos of high summer. Everyone's voice was suddenly lifted. Oh, but everyone was a bird. But it isn't a bird. It's a man in a bird suit, a song inside him, blue, shoulders instead of feathers. There is a sky teeming with winged things, birds with fiery plumage winging wildly across the white orchards and dark green fields on and out of sight. A stand of white pines, individual flames against the masonry of black smoke. The day-blind stars waiting with their light. Stillness falls like a cloud. Suddenly, she puts out her wing, the whole, full, flirtatious span of it. Blackbird, my lord, as nothing will hurt you. I'll sing as I love. Thank you.
Thank you, Nidhi. So maybe a question here, a big question, an open question. I mean, I think it's a fair observation to say that Nidhi is a very distinctive performer of her work. And my feeling, I guess, hearing it is the sense of becoming extremely aware of space and air and breath involved in saying a poem aloud, especially the way Nidhi says a poem aloud. And I think, well, I don't know, I've been particularly interested in well, I say interested. We've all been interested in air. It seems, particularly treacherous quality that we've been dealing with, and breath. And it's just, it's a very striking thing. And I was reminding myself of Auguries of a Minor God today, and hearing all the birds differently in it, and thinking about the way that book is presented, which is a really extraordinary and interesting thing. And I mean, I'm asking in some ways a kind of expected question, but I think there's maybe more interesting things in it. That this book might be experimental in some way. But I suppose I wanted to ask, how connected for you, Nidhi, is the eye and the ear? And a sort of secondary question, do you see yourself as experimental in any way, or what people, dare I say it, think they mean when they say experimental? So two things, the eye and the ear. And what is experimentation? What's it for?
I think for the first question, so, and I've spoken about this before as well, but poetry for me is sort of an invitation into intimacy, so it's a way that you can get as close to another being as possible using language. And I think the breath is sort of the spine for me, because it's the thread that holds the word and the experience together. And I think there is nothing more intimate than breath, because it is what gives us life, and without it, we are not. So I think in that sense, maybe retaining, or in some cases even reviving the oral tradition of poetry is really important to me, because I think one of our earliest experiences of storytelling for most of us, stories land in our ears long before we're able to actually read them ourselves. And so I think we sense story, or we sense poems before we see them. So the ear is sort of for me, the first portal, if you look at it that way, before the eye. And then to the experimental question, I think if the hallmark of an experiment is that the outcome is uncertain, it can succeed or fail, often spectacularly. I think, in that way, yes, I think my poems are experimental, because I don't really know what I'm trying to do with them when I set out to do them, and it is sort of it's a surprise for me as well to see where they land. But I think traditionally the poem, and maybe all writing, tends to want to order the world, to exert sort of a level of control, or to assert the primacy of the author. But I find that with poetry, it often works the other way for me. The poems they'll whisper things, and they'll fall apart, and they'll break down, and they'll sort of trail off and just leave me hanging, and there is that element of sort of not knowing where something is going to end up, that I weirdly find comfort there. I find it to be sort of soothing to not know things. So yeah, I think that's.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. Yeah, it's really interesting to think of experiments that way, and it's also, I think it's also true that, sometimes you do experiments twice, right, to make sure that things are still true, which I think is an important thing to do. And maybe one other question, because I think a major part certainly of your book perhaps involves this, a kind of attempt at intimacy, which is to say, if I'm reading it correctly, a marvelous long poem that. One way, maybe, of reading it, you might agree, is a way of creating a certain kind of intimacy between a European tradition and, I guess, probably generally the ancient Arab world, or perhaps the modern Arab world, through the figure of Fibonacci, who sort of brings numbers to us from the Arab world. Was that an example of starting out from, feeling that you know that these two things are going to be involved, these two worlds? Was that proceeding into the unknown and seeing what's going to happen? Creating a sense of a rule and then seeing where it goes.
Yeah, I think what inspired the structure of that long poem. So the long poem that Stephen is referring to is the second half of the book, and it sort of tries to merge the Fibonacci sequence, which is a mathematical pattern, with an abecedarian form of poem. I think that the genesis of that for me was, so I grew up in various countries in the Middle East, and the architecture is absolutely stunning, especially the mosques and other monuments. And they follow this kind of fractal pattern. It's all very sort of mathematically precise, and it always amazes me because I don't have a very mathematical brain, I don't think, so I don't tend to see things in that way, but I do see patterns. I just don't see sort of formula. And so when I knew I wanted to structure it around that somehow, and so the Fibonacci sequence sort of made sense in terms of giving me that constraint to work within, so I wasn't sort of going all over the place as a lot of the poems do in the first half, go all over the place. But yes, it does. I think it's again those images that sort of live in your head from when you're younger that they make an impression on you and you're not quite sure why. And I think it is trying to make sense of what is it about that draws me to that sort of order in the chaos somehow.
Thank you. I mean, a very provocative thing that we can talk about another time is, I can't escape the fact that Fibonacci sequence is so related to something like the golden ratio, the golden mean, which, the sonnet, arguably the sort of center of English, well, arguably sort of contemporary modern English poetry. You might have written one of the most astonishing sonnets that's ever been written, if that's sort of an involvement. But yeah. Maybe we can argue about that another time. It does seem that it's perhaps unlikely that our guests from elsewhere might be able to send their questions to us. But, as the way things used to be, you just encounter these poets in the streets and demand answers from them then, might be an alternative. But for those of you who are here, I wondered if you have any questions you would like to ask anyone, Charlie or Nidhi or Miho or Emily, anything about their work, anything you would ask them to, I don't know, clarify? Anything, any questions, any thoughts, any observations that you would like to make? Or indeed, you can ask each other things. Or I can ask you more things. But Summer would like to ask a question.
I would just like to ask, because a lot of these books and pamphlets and collections were done rather a long time ago, surely you have new projects on the go, and I would be really interested to know what those new projects are.
I might just restate that for our audience. It's a question, lovely question from Summer, which asks, these works have probably been produced some time ago. Certainly you have new things on the go now. You'll forgive me for paraphrasing. What are they? Is there any? Charlie, of course, has just published As If today.
So for a wee while I've been working actually with Nidhi on a sort of digital project of poems. There's 6 poems, and there's 2 guys, Michael Phoenix and Antoine Galea, who have created the soundtrack to go along with the poems, and Ian at Fallow Media has done an incredible presentation of the poems. So it's been a collaboration, and it's been a long time coming. It's really nice to have it online, and amazing to work with Nidhi, I think.
Thanks. And you alluded to something you're working on, Mícheál, I think.
Yes, I did.
Tell us about that.
I forget about bios. I'm working with the SQ Press. They have a series called Solstice series, and it's I don't really know what the idea of an emergent writer is or where I'm emergent from, but anyway, it matches up an emergent writer with an established writer. So I'm working with Kerry Doherty on a kind of mixture of prose and poetry into like this kind of beautiful art book kind of thing, amongst other things. Yeah, I think that would be probably the thing. Probably the most concrete poetry thing, really, would be I'm working on a retelling of The Keen for Art O'Leary. At the moment, it's probably the most project-like thing I'm doing at the minute, but other than that, keeping quiet.
What about you, Emily? What are you working on? I mean, I did read some of the things you're working on, but you tell us some more about them or other things?
I have a lot of projects. I love starting projects, but finishing them is sometimes a bit of a struggle. I've just finished a collaborative collection with Joe Burns on 3 of Picasso's Muses or Lovers, and we're currently trying to find a home for it. I really love it. It's one of those. It's a weird collection where it was really brilliant to write with Joe, and it's kind of strange when I read it back because it was actually written it was finished about 6 months ago now, and when I read it back, it feels like someone else wrote it. This is a very odd sensation. So that's one that's actually finished, and I'm writing a prose book on. It started on solitude, but sort of has veered off into women artists, Irish women artists in particular. And I have a few other projects relating to that in the works that'll hopefully come to fruition in the next couple of years. And I'm also writing my next solo collection, poetry. And yeah, I think that's enough for now.
I agree. Nidhi, anything? You're involved in all sorts of things, I guess. But I mean, surely you deserve something of a rest after having just very recently published your book, but no doubt you're not resting so much.
No doubt. I'm working on a sequence of poems about unicorns and sort of hybrid horse-human creatures, and
Sure, yeah.
a couple of essays about the grotesque in art. As you do.
That sounds marvelous.
What are you working on?
Oh no, I'm taking a break. I'm nothing in particular. We'll see. Could I invite any further questions? Any other thoughts? Any other comments? They don't have to be panel wide. They could be specific. Is there any questions I asked to anyone else that you would like somebody else to answer?
Yes.
Yes?
I was what you were asking Nidhi before about the relationship between dye and the ear. I'm actually interested in an answer from everyone. Like when a poem comes to you, let's say, do you I hear fragments of sentences or like a phrase, and then from there something emerges. But I can imagine that some people see something as well. It's very vague, but you understand the question.
Yeah, so just to sort of restate it, it's sort of another version of that question of, what comes first? Is it, and I suppose it's hard to say, but for the sake of the question, may I say, is it primarily a sort of auditory experience first, or visual or imaginary one first?
Yeah, and drawing on that as well, whether when you first hear a sentence or a poem and how you read it, then the reading's like this. Is there a relation between that? Or is it completely different? Or do you know from the outset how to understand?
Well, you've been collecting anecdotes, you said. I mean, that seems primarily an auditory experience, that it's related to story, to sound, to voice, and all those things you can't shake, isn't it?
I think for the anecdotes is like a compulsion thing. It's something that I've inherited from my family, where we'll go somewhere, like my mother's family are all from Donegal, and we'll drive somewhere, and like every single time we go past a certain landmark, she will repeat the same story. So the anecdote compulsion is something that I can't resist. I feel like it's like it gets caught in my throat and I have to say it. It's like there's no controlling it, and it can be very irritating to be around if you're around me a lot. So I think that's probably related into writing poetry, in that it's like that feeling of not being able to contain this thought and having to make something out of it quite quickly, because I'm sure all of you have this in common, or I assume you have this in common. It goes away quite quickly if you don't grab onto it. So I think that anecdote thing it's definitely related to the act of writing.
It's like documenting your strange observations.
Yeah.
It always feels very wispy. I tie them up into two different things. So it's like what you perceive or what you hear, what you steal, and then how you write it down and twist it in your own kind of strange way. I see them as two temporally different. Usually they happen sometimes weeks, months apart, but that's how it works for me. I also love compound, messy things and stuff.
It's extremely interesting. What do you think? I mean, Charlie, you're full of sounds, you're full of voice.
I guess maybe it starts with an image or something, then I start to think about it in my head, and it as a compulsion or something that you have to write it down in some way or another. Otherwise, if somebody's talking to me, all I have is this this thing in my head, and then comes, I guess, in terms of reading aloud, I almost just think about the sort of the music or whatever is the poem in my head. I don't ever really read it as I'm writing. I think maybe even I've read one of the poems aloud for the first time tonight, having wrote it about 2 years ago. So I don't tend to read things aloud as I'm writing, I suppose is what I'm trying to say, but it comes in my head instead, which is maybe a safer place.
I guess there's all kinds of approaches. Well, maybe we should bring our evening almost to a close, but let me almost close by saying thank you again very much to the Museum of Literature Ireland for hosting us so warmly. Thank you to everyone for being there on your various screens. Thank you especially for being with us in the room with the gentlest and one of the nicest dogs that I guess we've ever encountered. Thank you very much for being here. And thank you, Charlie and Nidhi and Mícheál and Emily. I'm going to hand over to Nidhi for a moment for something very new to me, but very exciting. Nidhi's going to explain what that is.
So in the spirit of experimentation, Stephen's second book of poems, Cheryl's Destinies, came out very recently, last month, much anticipated and to much acclaim. When it arrived in the post and when I turned to the first page, my heart literally glowed because the opening poem, The Curfew, is one of my favourite poems of all time and definitely one of my favourite poems of Stephen's. So the poem is narrated by a speaker who is obliged to stay indoors for, days on end, which is an experience that, we're all familiar with. And he passes the time by recounting stories about his grandfather. So we thought in closing that we would read you this poem, but we'd read it sort of together. So with gratitude to Stephen for giving us the chance to share in this reading tonight. I will start. The Curfew. The radicals sprung the locks that night. Hurrah! And their lovely collarbones were almost moonly. Rhinos shrieked and bellowed, elephants tromboned, and the animals nosed into town. Sunrise to sunrise and sunrise, we kept indoors. If you can't count your onions, what can you count? My grandfather used to say. He said a lot of things. Among the other miners, he was legendary.
When no more than a thought of the pink crumple of his infant daughter's body came to mind, a glow would swell in the pit. The men would mayhem bauxite by the light. His tenderness emitted. Some of me lived inside her even then. The memorial fountain says nothing of the weeks before the rescue failed.
Who mentions God, which, as my grandfather used to say, is just a name of the plateau you view the consequences of your living from, or something like that. He said a lot of things. He grew wise and weary as an albatross and left for that great kingdom of nevertheless. It would have pleased his handsome shoulders to watch this grizzly scoop for salmon.
In the fountain of his friends, or the Bengals, or the shakedown squad of chimpanzees who bang and bang on the grocery window. One by one, 11 miners starved to death. In the streets, they collar or tranquilize the ocelots and run a spike of ketamine to the plumbing in the fountain, dromedaries, blue mood around the pub.
Aloof under their reservoirs of fat. I don't sleep, but oh plateau, these days of violence have been my happiest. Even a cabbage is not without desire, my grandfather said one day. And now among the animals, I feel under my wings the words for things I thought I knew departing, and I understand him. Thanks very much.